Welcome back to part 2 of our gauge restoration segment. Okay, so everything's pretty much ready to go here. We got all our gauges caught up to the same state. Everything's pretty much repainted, reconditioned, and polished up, ready to go here. So I think probably the best way to do this, let's just take one gauge at a time. We can break down its function and assembly process as we put it together. Then if there's any slight variations from gauge to gauge, we can explain them at that time. So let's go ahead and get started with our speedometer first and see what's involved with that. All right, first let's grease up our magnet. And just a touch more grease inside our shaft here. It's pretty dry inside. And then our next gear set and shaft. Let's see if we can see it turning in there. And then next, our magnet contact and retainer. Make sure that's plenty tight. And then we'll drop our ball in there and just wedge it down in there. Using a socket here just to press that down in there and drive it down in until I feel it seat. At that point I'm stopping, not pressing too hard. And the main thing, we want to make sure that our gear set is still turning around there. So everything feels good. I have just a little bit of in play, which is what we should have there. If you don't have any in play, you're too tight. Okay, next we're going to have to get this little pin here seated down this little hole here. So I'm going to just drop a little bit of 3-in-1 oil on that, and then just kind of play with it as we seat it, see how that goes. Just a drop of 3-in-1, and then soaking up the excess. Okay, I can feel that that's seated. Right there. All right, now we'll set our other screw. Make sure we got a good coat of grease on everything. All right, that's pretty much going to do it for that one. All right, and then moving on to our housing here. So what I've done to restore all our housings, I've gone ahead and polished up the outside with a Blue Magic polish, and that works pretty good. So the original zinc coating on this was still in pretty good shape with the exception of the clock. The inside here, I've masked everything off, reshot everything on the inside with a bright silver paint. That should help out our dash lights. So start by pressing our seal back in there. So this is the original seal, still in pretty good shape. All right, and that just presses down in there. So getting started with the dial face, so I'm just using a little bit of contact on the back side of the chrome just to set this first one. And then I'm going to do the same thing to our freshly painted black trim here. And what I'm going to do is press this rivet back in there first. So that should stay in there. You can see it's sticking out just a little bit here. So what I want to do, I'm just going to spread a little bit of contact cement around here on our chrome and then set it. And just peeling off a little bit of putty tape there. I'm sticking in the end of the cap here, just wadding it up on an end. And these caps have a big notch in it and a small notch in it. The small notch will go towards the front of the needle. And what that's going to help do is just going to help weight the needle, and it's also going to help press that in and conform to the inner shape there. And just making sure she's fully seated in there. You can actually feel it kind of click into place there. Okay, next let's go ahead and mount this to the inside of our housing. And then looking at this seal here, so this is our original seal, still in really good condition. So we're just reusing that. And what this is what they call a light chute. So this seals up against the back side of your dial face, and then when your dash light comes on, your little green light there, this stops light from bleeding out and coming through the rest of your instrumentation. So just keeps a really good sealed light directly on that green lens. And then next we stack up all our trim and just screw it down very, very gently. So our needle is going to be a little bit tricky to install. So what's happening, this is going to press down over our shaft here. And we're going to press it down on the back side of our needle stop. So you see how it's just hanging and kind of bouncing. It's stuck on our shaft, but it's not really tight. So what we got to do, we got to cement that on there, and we got to be very careful what kind of cement we use. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to use some flat black model paint. It's real thin. The paint will act like an adhesive, and I'm going to set it down over there and hang it about there overnight. Once that dries, then we're going to go ahead and move the needle up and over into this position. If I don't cement that, then what's going to happen when we start the car up and start driving it, that shaft is going to spin on the needle, and we're going to be pulling it back out of the dash again. So let's go ahead and put a little paint on there and set that needle, get that drying overnight. So we're just going to put a little tiny drop right down inside. And it won't be so strong that if we have to pry this needle back off again, that paint will break loose and allow us to get our needle off safely. All right, right about there. That's where she wants to hang. And so what's got to happen, this spring actually has to have a little bit of preload on it, so when we bring it up to rest on here, it'll have positive force against our stop there. All right, and then looking at our clock here, so we're all reconditioned here. We're just going to package all this up, send this back to Hollywood Speedometer. So what they're going to do, they're just going to reset everything, press our needles back together, and tune up our clock and send it back to us. All right, so back to our speedometer here this morning. So I think our needle is dried up plenty good. Let's see if we can flick that over the top there. Okay, there it is. Now you see we have a positive. It wants to stay on that stop there. So if we didn't preload it, what would happen is the needle would bounce around and move too freely. I think that's going to work out just fine. So before we close it up, let's just go ahead and try to troubleshoot a speedometer and any kind of theoretical problems you might have. So let's say, for example, you have a bouncing needle. Problem most likely would be speedometer cable or the gear set at the transmission gearbox would cause this thing to bounce as you're driving. Let's say your needle's working fine, but your odometer is not working. That is going to be gear set inside. And a lot of the later model speedometers, they had plastic gear sets, so teeth do break off on those. They get a little bit dried out, and you can have some issues there. If your trip odometer is not working, it's most likely either your cable is seized up or a broken gear set in there also. All right, so we're ready to close things up now. So before we close everything up, we just want to check everything over very carefully, making sure there's no fingerprints on here, any kind of dust flecks, any kind of issue. If there is something on there, you can use a soft brush to remove it, or real low air pressure, compressed air will be very helpful. And then also our glass lenses. I'm waxing both sides of our glass lenses and checking those up into a light, making sure we don't have any kind of dust on there, any kind of fingerprints or anything. So once we put it on there, that's pretty much going to be it. No way to be able to clean it out once we're sealed. So our first inside ring, we got the inside nice bright silver, and outside painted up black, making sure there's nothing on there. A little something there. Looking over real good. And then dealing with our trim rings here, so you can replace these trim rings with new replacements, and that would probably be the simplest solution. These ones are original to the car. They're made out of brass, and they chrome up really nice. The only problem is the chroming process allows too much buildup on the back side or the inside of the bezel here. So what you're going to have to do is take a small Dremel, some tools, some different sanding wheels, and remove all that excess chrome, copper, and nickel plating in there, and get down to the bare brass, which takes quite a while, about an hour per bezel. Otherwise, you won't get these back over the lip on your gauges. So before you get started, you can see how much chrome buildup is on these guys. Get the focus here. There's quite a bit of chrome in there, so all that'll have to be removed, or I'll never get them on there. So next we'll install our outer ring and the bezel. Seat that down in there. And then also I've made a notation here with this yellow reference mark here. So this particular mark here on our gauge housing is the easiest location for me to reinstall this bezel. If you're using new bezels, won't have to worry about that. They should just slip right over the housing and not have any issues there. So for our speedometer and tachometer, I'm not going to seal down the backside of our chrome bezel because I just want to make sure when we hook this up to the car that everything inside here is functioning properly. If I pinch these down and have to re-lift these back up, I don't think I'll be able to reuse these trim rings again. So for now, I'm just going to keep it on there. It's plenty tight, not going to go anywhere. And then we'll just put our gasket on the back side of it. We'll go ahead and install it into the dash, use it like this until we've gone through troubleshooting, actually driving the car, make sure everything's right. If anything's wrong at that point, I would just pull it back out and send it into North Hollywood Speedometer. All right, so 1 down, 4 to go. On the back side here, I'm covering up the holes with a little tape just to make sure we don't get any dust or debris inside this before we install it inside the car. That's going to be our finished look there. Very happy with the results on that. Let's go ahead and set this one aside then. We'll move on to our tachometer and see what's involved with that. So starting with our tachometer housing, we just want to make sure our chrome trim ring is going to sit over that before we start assembling. And then our light chutes for our turn signals here, these are original, still in real nice condition, nice and supple, so we'll reuse those. However, the bottom light chute here, this was a completely different material they used in there for those bottom chutes. I sent mine into North Hollywood Speedometer to see if they could replace it with something. Unfortunately, they don't have anything in stock, and theirs have been on a back order for quite some time. So I'm just going to go ahead and make one up using an old spark plug boot and sliding that guy over the bottom there. And then we'll just push that in there until we don't want it all the way seated. So what we'll do is we'll leave it proud a little bit, and then when the dial faceplate pushes down and seats, make sure we get a good seal on that light there. So that'll work temporarily. If I have to pull this trim ring off down the road to put a fresh new one in there, that'd be no problem. So looking at our dial face here, restoration process basically the same as everything else. And then setting this needle here, I'm just going off of memory because I've actually put this together about 4 years ago, and I'm only starting to work with it now. So I think if my memory serves correctly, that the shaft on this is a slotted shaft, so there's no way to put this needle on here incorrectly. It will have its own stop. There is no stop needle here. You see how that just has a positive stop. So that's pretty much how that works. And you'll have to cement that also using probably some paint is going to work the best. And looking at the back side, so I'm using a real soft weather stripping and real thin here to create a light seal from our custom-made light chute there. That should work out just fine. You can see it's embossed in there. That's going to seal that light off real nice. And then our Mylar lenses, those just tape back in position there with clear tape. So basically how this works, it's going to receive 12 volts from your system and deliver it to the needle through a series of diodes in the gauge here. And you can see how this works here is your magnetic field that turns your needle. And so if your needle is bouncing, the problem most likely is in the delivery of your 12 volts to the gauge. Not necessarily is it the gauge that would be faulty. It would be an erratic signal or an erratic voltage to your gauge. And then also a drop right down here, and then just move the oil around a little bit. Install our inner trim. And then our outer trim. And putting our seal on. All right, that takes care of our tack, all sealed up and ready to go. Moving on to our temperature gauge. So our housing really pretty simple, just 2 light chutes here. I'm using the original, still in good condition there. So the only thing really to look out for in this one, you have a setback stop on the top here. This would be our top location. And then you have one down here and one down here. And what that does, that just bottoms out where the dial face will set up against. That'll give it some kind of a stopping point. So our temperature gauge, really pretty simple unit. It's just basically a winding and some real fine wires in there. Look how fine that guy is there. And this is why I recommend not doing any kind of a voltage bench test. You could have an accident. You could actually fry that in a nanosecond. This one seems to be mechanically working very well. Got good spring action and return action on the spring. Just going to lubricate the shaft there. And how I painted this needle, this was done about 4 years ago. I don't have any video, unfortunately, of that, but I do have a picture. Let me put a picture in there and show you how I mask this off so you can clean up the needle and repaint it using aluminum foil. And then for the backing plate up against our light chute, I'm using a little bit of weather stripping, just some basic weather stripping there. Low density foam, and that helps it compress and conform to help seal off this area here. So this light here is actually white, so I want to trap that really good, and that's just going to seat down in there like that. And then our gauge. And then looking at the front here, you can see our stop tabs right at the top there. And then right behind here and here. So I think I'm going to hold off on the rolling of that back side of that lip there. Easy enough to pull these out of the dashboard and roll that later. Just want to make sure once we get the car up and running, no need to send these gauges in for any kind of servicing. If I roll that lip now and for some reason I need to get back in there, I don't think I'll be able to reuse these existing trims. All right, and then moving on to our fuel gauge here. So this one basically is pretty much the same as our temperature gauge. It works basically off of ohms resistance from our sending unit here. You can see we've got a resistor in here, just a basic winding, and a spring to move the needle. So we still got really good spring action here, so I think we're going to be okay with this one. As far as our sending unit goes, just removing the lock washer and nut off the bottom here, and this just comes out. And how this works, so this is a float that works off the level of your gas tank. And as your gas tank becomes full, we get towards the top here. And then as your gas tank drains, we get towards the bottom here. And it's got a series of contact points, top and bottom here, that will give you resistance or no resistance on your gauge. About 72 ohms at the bottom there at our contact point. And then as we go towards the top here, our contacts there should read about 2.7 ohms. And you can bench test one of these safely. You wouldn't have to worry about burning one of these up. You can just hook up a multimeter, and that should be about where your ohms reading should be. And then putting it back together here. So these will be shipped with a safety pin. That'll be right in this location here. So before you install it in your tank, you have to make sure you pull that safety pin out. So here's the one that came out of the car. This one's completely shot. And so if you've got a problem with your fuel gauge, the problem most likely is in the sending unit. And here's what happens. So as your float slides up and down, our shaft here can become rusted. Depending on how old your tank is, how much moisture has been in the tank over years, it can be a little bit rusty or choppy on its slide up and down. This is the center of the float, actually frozen on there. I'm going to break that loose just to get it to move. So no way this one would have ever worked. But if your gas gauge is not working or your needle's stuck in a certain position, probably it's because your float is stuck. It's not sliding up and down this shaft like it should be. So easy enough to pull one of these out and replace it, or easy enough to pull one of these out, take it apart and inspect it, and maybe you could free up whatever's wrong here, clean up that. A little 2000 grit sandpaper would probably help that. and get it back to working condition. So assembly on this one's pretty basic. Let's just go ahead and roll through it and see what she looks like. All right, we got one little indent on the bottom here, right there. All right, there's our finished look on our gas gauge. Nothing really difficult about that one. All right, and that's going to be our finished look. So we're just waiting on our clock to come back from North Hollywood Speedometer. As soon as that comes back, we'll put it together and get these guys installed. Also, guys, just a reminder, if you're doing a light restoration on your gauges or a refresh, everything you've seen here in the last 2 videos is now available in our new store. Well, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.